All right. Well, I want to welcome all of you joining here at the Wisconsin Energy Institute or joining us online via Zoom. Welcome to another installment of the Forward in Energy Forum. If this is your first time joining us, my name is Scott Williams. I'm the Research and Education Coordinator at the Wisconsin Energy Institute. And our mission here at WI is to provide leadership on campus for multidisciplinary research, education, and outreach efforts with the goal of accelerating the world's transition to clean energy systems and solutions. The Forward in Energy Forum is part of our efforts here at WI to cultivate public understanding of energy issues. And this is a monthly series that brings together experts both on and off campus to discuss the many different technical, social, political, and economic dimensions of our transition to clean energy systems and solutions. And as you'll hear from today's panel, Wisconsin has an opportunity to be a leader in utilizing renewable and waste resources to make new fuels, chemicals, and other products that we currently get from fossil fuels. And so we'll hear from a great panel of experts who will share their work in developing a bioeconomy that's sustainable, resilient, and circular. Finally, to moderate today's panel and set the stage for the discussion, I'm pleased to introduce Mary Blanchard, who's Associate Director of the Wisconsin Energy Institute. Mary has been with WI since 2014, overseeing the day-to-day operations of WI and leading strategic efforts to grow WI's impact on campus and around the state. She also brings 20 years of industry experience, most recently as Director of Marketing and Governmental Affairs at Virent. And Mary has been the driving force behind WI's recent Bioeconomy initiative, which she'll share a lot more about right now. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Scott, and thanks to everyone for being here today. We're really pleased to have the folks who are here in person and those of you who are here online. As Scott said, today's event is part of a bigger initiative at WEI to work towards building a circular bioeconomy ecosystem. This is an effort that's funded by an organization called Innovation Incubators, which is a collaboration of Wells Fargo Bank and the National Renewable Energy Lab. We've had great promotional partners in the Wisconsin Tech Council, the Wisconsin Biogas Council, Energy on Wisconsin, and the Wisconsin Sustainable Business Council. So we appreciate their assistance. The idea behind the grant and this initiative is really recognizing the complexity of building supply chains in the bioeconomy that by its nature need to be very localized and distributed to be close to the biomass. There are a lot of changes that are happening in the supply chain as well, because end producers are now really needing to know the details of the practices of their supply chain members. And I've recently heard a new phrase called the decommodification of supply chains, because people really need to understand what's happening along the way, and you can't just buy from anyone. The goal of this overall effort is to create a framework that could share knowledge to build common understanding and help build and strengthen stakeholder connections in the bioeconomy. This diagram is really WEI's vision for the bioeconomy, in which purpose-grown non-food sources, organic waste, gaseous waste are being converted in an agile, resilient, and sustainable network to be made into fuels and power, materials, chemicals, biochar as a supplement, or to be captured and sequestered as well. So that's sort of our vision of the overall network. In this initiative, we've had 3 meetings so far focused on 3 particular areas. The first is renewable natural gas, which is when you're cleaning up biogas from anaerobic digestion so that it could be injected into the pipeline and transported to other markets, specifically California, where it has great value as part of California's low carbon fuel standard. Carbon management, in which there's value for improved practices that can help sequester carbon in soil and other natural systems, or even more industrial systems, or into cement and things like that. And then SAF, which is sustainable aviation fuels and bio-based chemicals, in which renewable biomass is being converted, again, into fuels and chemicals in place of fossil fuels. So as I've said, we've had 3 workshops to date. We'll have 2 additional meetings, the next of which will be May 25th in Madison, and we're confirming a location for another meeting June 21st, which will be somewhere not in Madison, but we haven't confirmed that yet. So I really, again, appreciate the opportunity to focus on these important issues with this great panel. I'll go ahead and introduce them. From left to right, as you see them, the first is Brian Langoff, who is the Director of Biogas Systems and Research and Development at UW Oshkosh. He is responsible for the technical oversight of biogas operations, conducting biogas research, and providing digester training and consulting services and internal and external program outreach. Prior to managing UW Oshkosh's biogas systems, Langoff managed the university's Environmental Research and Innovation Center from 2010 to 2014. He holds a master's degree in microbiology from UW Oshkosh. Next to Brian, to his right is, or to as we're going right, is Dr. Pamela Toss, who's an assistant professor and Sustainability and Renewable Energy Systems Program Coordinator at UW Platteville. Dr. Toss earned her PhD in plant breeding and biogenetics and plant genetics from UW-Madison. She is also a member and faculty advisor for the Wisconsin Association of Energy Engineers and is a member of the American Society for Engineering Education. Dr. Toss's current research interests lie in biorenewable resources with a focus on biofuels for green aviation fuel and biodiesel. This work consists of identifying and implementing agronomic practices that can better help with crop integration for the Midwest region. Next is Dr. Tim Donahue, who is the director of the Wisconsin Energy Institute and Great Lakes Bioenergy. He is the Ira L. Baldwin Professor of Bacteriology, UW Foundation Fetzer Bascom Professor. Dr. Donahue is an internationally recognized expert on bio and genome-based conversion of renewable resources into valuable products. He is a past president and current secretary of the American Society for Microbiology and is an honorary fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Since 2007, Dr. Donahue has served as principal investigator and director of Great Lakes Bioenergy, a U.S. Department of Energy Office of Science funded renewable fuels and chemicals research center that has trained some 1,000 scientists and engineers, made advances contained in over 200 patent applications and 100 licensed technologies, and provided the scientific knowledge that has formed the basis of 5 startup companies. And last but not least is Diane Mayerfeld. Diane is the Sustainable Agriculture Coordinator for the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Division of Extension. She helps educators and farmers learn about sustainable agriculture techniques and resources, including grants from the USDA Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. Current areas of focus include climate change, working with diverse farmers, and perennial cropping systems. She earned her PhD from the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at UW-Madison and researches silvopasture in Wisconsin. Thanks again to you all for being here. I'm going to pass the microphone down to Brian where he can start.
All right, thanks, Mary. Thanks, everyone, for having me here today, and those online that can't see and interact with quite as much. It's a pleasure to be here again. A few of my opening remarks, a little bit background about myself and kind of the areas of activities that kind of relate to the topic today that I was asked to cover. Again, my name is Brian. I'm from the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. I'm currently serve as the director of our biogas program. I've worn many different hats over my 13 years being at UW-Oshkosh, from starting out a laboratory that was really focused on external being an external resource for the community and the state, and quite frankly, across the US, where my area of focus is really on testing waste feedstocks for different clients that wanted to look at processing those through anaerobic digestion to make biogas. And then, being able to assess those through biomethane potential tests, and really give people kind of an answer on kind of what biogas potential those materials have and how they might work in combination, as well as like testing different digesters for their health. Again, trying to keep the reliability of these systems up. A lot of times you see some of these projects that have had issues in the past, due to, people might focus on the mechanical side of the systems, but forget about the biology and chemistry or vice versa. And I think we'll get into some of these other topics of some of the key challenges and opportunities as we get through the day or this afternoon. In addition, we started a biogas program. We actually developed and own and operate 3 digesters that we built between the years of 2010 and 2014. Currently today, we still own 2 of those assets. We sold one of those off, which I can explain a little bit more later. But again, so we're owner operators. So part of my role too from time to time has been actually physical operations in the field, working on these systems, taking after hours calls. So I'm very in depth in what it takes to run these systems that relate to kind of a successful biocircular economy. Then also kind of work a lot on, again, obviously incorporating some of these things into our campus, meeting sustainability plans, meeting our teaching and research plans. But I do a lot of work in consulting and research for external clients, whether it be, again, troubleshooting digester health or helping them look at feasibility of projects. Outside of those functions at the university, I also sit on the board of directors for the American Biogas Council. Been on my third term now as a director there. Worked on a number of different initiatives, from developing digester operators school and training to really get certified operators to the American Biogas Council. Again, some of the key challenges, as I mentioned earlier, with certain projects that have failed, is really having standardization across the industry, and really getting training, because some of these systems might be on small farms, or they could be at very large, 500, large companies. So various scales of how this gets implemented to really be successful in Wisconsin as a full circular economy. Again, we need to be able to operate, I think, at many different scales. Also worked on some initiatives with the American Biogas Council around digestate certification, kind of a newer program they're going to be launching here shortly. Again, it's really helping, again, put standards in the industry from a kind of non-governmental organization, kind of helping promote and develop the growth of biogas in the United States. And really that's to really, I think, will help with this biocircular economy as we look at more digestate utilization, developing additional fertilizer-based products, incorporating that for soil health. Again, I think there's a lot of opportunity there on that side. So really, again, making sure people are operating these systems properly, not overfeeding them or cramming material through too quickly just to get tipping fees. Really have some standardization to make sure what's going in, what's coming out, has good quality standards. So some of the key opportunities I see related to this topic of this biocircular economy, I think Wisconsin is really well situated. Again, we have a large livestock agricultural industry. We have large food processing, growing of crops and food processing. Again, being leaders in the nation in those areas, I think we can really be a leader in this development of this biocircular economy. Really tapping more into harnessing anaerobic digestion as kind of a base technology, but then taking all those different waste products from the front end, and again, all the opportunities on the back end of taking the nutrients out, the energy out. I think biogas, again, is a key opportunity to, it's a very versatile product that you can do many different things with, from electric generation to renewable natural gas to aviation fuel, diesel, through different technology upgrades. Utilizing our natural gas grid and pipeline for storage and transfer of that material. Again, I think is a huge opportunity for us to leverage these things throughout the state. Some of the key challenges, I'm just at the very high level here right now. Again, I think many of these systems are fairly expensive still to incorporate and run and build. And again, if you're looking at, just as an example, the dairy industry, a lot of these profit margins for these farmers are fairly tight. So without different incentive programs or making permitting easier, streamlining some of these processes, it can become a little challenging for some of these things to scale at different ends. In Wisconsin today, we have, I think, just under now 7,000 dairy farms, but really we only have digesters, biogas systems on less than 1% of them in the state. So there's a huge amount of material just in that sector alone that we can tap into, producing more of these systems. And again, beyond just the energy generation from those, I think really a bigger area is the nutrient side, growing soil quality, making cover crops that then biomass that can go back and harvest into digesters, incorporating other technologies, whether it be pyrolysis, gasification, biochar incorporation of soils. Again, I think there's all these other ancillary things that can really build around that and really make these projects successful and really make a full kind of circular economy. I think I'll stop there for now.
Great. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. My name is Pamela Tosh. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm excited to talk with you today. So as Mary had suggested or had announced, I run the Sustainability and Renewable Energy Program at UW-Platteville. We are one of the oldest programs in the nation, actually, for renewable energy. We've seen 3 presidents now, and in those 3 have done lots of ups and downs. At that school, I have helped to increase that program from a very small sector looking at photovoltaics to now incorporating green building management, land use, sustainability, land use, bioproducts, a new bioplastics program, and a more of an integration between us and our business school of how to make the monetary arguments needed for sustainability and for renewable energy on scales that are not just government incentives. So I do that. That's a big portion of my time. Another portion of my time is I do teach a few classes, which is pretty fun. So I teach a data analysis class. I teach a biofuels class where we get students out into the field making diesel, making ethanol, really kind of seeing what these processes go into. On the side of that, I do a lot of projects with companies. I also have my own consulting firm and I do energy modeling, somewhat project management, but a lot of utilization of what resources they have and what they can do with it. I've done projects now with Vortex Optics, Spectrum Brands, looking at life cycle assessment. When we talk about the circular bioeconomy, and we think of plants, it's awesome to think about plants as these green attributes, but plants are little chemical farms and there's so much utility in them and around them. When we talk about our supply chain, it's not just on the front end, how can we use them, but also on the back end, how do we recycle them? How do we throw them away? And what does those end units look like? So I do that. And on a research side, I'm just finishing up a 5-year USDA CAP grant with 5 other schools. So I represent the Wisconsin branch. We've got folks from University of Minnesota, Ohio State, Western Illinois, Illinois University. In that grant, we were given the task to commercialize a weed crop called pennycress. Many of you know pennycress is one of the first things that come up in spring. It starts to flower. It's a great early pollinator crop, especially for flies. There's some research that says bees use it as well, but really it's great for flies. But we took that crop and we domesticated it for or as a cash cover crop system. So the idea is that a farmer harvests their corn, hopefully early season corn. We worked with silage corn and then planted pennycress in September, let it start to grow and really set down roots in its rosette. So it helped with soil erosion. It also helped with phosphorus removal. We have huge issues, especially in this area, in the state of Wisconsin, with our water quality. And so any kind of plant or biomass that we can put on a field to help sequester some of those extra nutrients that were put on during the growing season is vital. So we were able to piggyback on that. It overwinters. Pennycress's sister is canola. It's part of the Brassica family. So in spring, it's one of the first things to come up, works as that early pollinator. And the hope or the aim of our program was to get it ready for harvest in late May, early June. Now we were looking at developing pennycress not only for Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, but also our lower states through Southern Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, that region. Pennycress works really well in southern states. We're having a little bit of a difficulty, and we'll probably talk more about this now in our northern states because we have to harvest it about June 16. And if you farm soybeans or you know any bean growers, they are already looking to put their beans in well before that date. So we talk about supply chain and supply chain mechanisms. One of them is getting growers on board. And it's difficult to do that when you say, hey, look, you're going to take a hit in your soybean, but you'll get a gain in your oil production. How we use pennycress is once it comes up, it has very small seeds, about as big as mustard seeds, actually, or lettuce seeds, and we press it for oil. And then we use that oil for biodiesel, green aviation fuels, our big contract that came through. Or you could branch off and go through different kinds of green chemicals. But getting all of the logistics to really match in the state of Wisconsin is big. Brian was talking about what are our key challenges that we find. Well, this initiative that we used for pennycress started with the Danforth Center in St. Louis. That was a large contributor when Monsanto was still around. They folded in and then donated a lot of their property and land to the Danforth Center. That is a system or a setup that allows an incubation for tons of little companies to go in, try different plant genomics, try different things. Our sister company, so this is a USDA grant with institutions, our industrial company is CoverCress. And so they were able to come in, start working with us as researchers. We got the genetics down for actual domestication, but also, okay, we have this crop, we're going to use its seed for oil. Awesome, excellent. But what about the rest of it? Once we press it, then what do we do? Do we shove it in a biodigester? Do we chuck it into a landfill? Do we put it back on the soil? The issue with pennycress is that it had a couple really noxious chemicals, uric acid, glucosinolates, that made it really difficult to feed to cattle or chicken or pig. So in the breeding side of our program, we knocked down those compounds so that we could really feed our waste, if you will, into these other secondary and tertiary systems. Coming out of that, Covercrest, our company got bought out, or not bought out, 65% of the shares are now owned by Bayer aspirin brand. They're the company that bought out Monsanto. And now Chevron has a 2-year contract with us to make jet fuel. So it's always interesting when we look at challenges state by state. I would love to say that all of this is being done in the state of Wisconsin, but we don't have all the setup that we need to allow that to happen. So we've had to look at Illinois and Ohio to do it. But the potential's out there, and especially for uses of our primary, secondary, and tertiary products, it's readily available. We just need some more backing and maybe more dedicated thinking of how we can tap into that. So I will end here.
Okay, thank you. Closer. Okay, thank you. And thank you all for being here, both in person and online. Mary did a great job with introducing me. I'll just say I've been a faculty member at UW-Madison for 37 years next week. And I see this as a prime example of what we're talking about today, is a prime example of something that is near and dear to the heart of everyone that works at UW-Madison. And that's the Wisconsin idea, because we're trying to bring discoveries that we make at our home institutions out to benefit society. So this initiative of a circular bioeconomy may sound like a gleam in the eye of some academic people. And I want to try and dismiss that thought by at least citing one report that I've cited a lot recently, and that's a report from the McKinsey Global Institute in 2020 entitled The Biorevolution. And in that report, they estimate that the bioeconomy has the potential to represent 60% of the global economy in the 21st century. So we are really at an inflection point where we could move from existing processes in industrialized nation away from traditional ways of doing things like chemistry and using fossil fuels to a bio-based economy. We could also take that technology and allow developing countries who haven't built a big industrial base to use the types of materials that people on the panel are going to talk about as the basis of their local economy, so that they can generate things locally instead of importing them from elsewhere in the world. And that's true if you think about Wisconsin in the US, but it's also true if you think about the Asian rim with growing economies, Africa with growing economies, and industrialized nations like the US, who wants to switch and be as nimble as possible. And even the European sector, who for the last year have been caught in the throes of a horrific event called a war that is trying to figure out how to build an economy that's going to be more sustainable moving forward. So to power that economy are the materials on the left-hand side of Mary's slide. And people on this panel have expertise, I would say, in just about all of them. So I hope you ask us about those. In the Wisconsin Energy Institute, I would say we focus on two types of raw materials on the left. The first is biomass, the lignocellulose, not the oils, the leftovers that she was talking about, and how we can turn that into juices or liquid fractions from the plant cellulose, which is sugars, and the lignin, which is aromatics, and generate fuels and chemicals from as much of a ton of biomass as possible. So nothing goes to waste. The things we can't convert Well, pass to the anaerobic digesters, right? So the other feedstock that we're becoming more and more interested in the Energy Institute is dairy. Dairy materials, working with our friends across the street in the Center for Dairy Research. And actually, I was just at an American Dairy Products Institute talk 2 weeks ago, talking about what we're starting to do with dairy residues, everything from solubilized manure, which is rich in organics that can be upgraded in fuels, to leftover cheese whey, yogurt whey, and the filtrates that are accumulated as you process milk and sell it in the marketplace. And these are materials that are, quite frankly, very low value to the dairy industry. And they're trying to figure out profitable and environmental responsive solutions to deal with that. So if you look at Wisconsin as an agricultural state, they are rich in lignocellulose from forestry, from crop residues, from waste food that isn't sellable at supermarkets or doesn't pass food pantries, to the dairy industry. And what can we do with those? And I would submit, as somebody who heard about states like Wisconsin as a young boy growing up in New York City, you haven't figured out this isn't a Wisconsin accent yet. It was always part of this thing called the breadbasket west of the George Washington Bridge. You can think of yourself as the Middle East of agricultural residues. And why not convert them into profitable things for farmers and rural communities to make a living on and increase their economic opportunity and grow all new industries, making the kinds of products that we depend on getting from fossil fuels and elsewhere. So I think there's opportunities there to make revenue for producers with the kinds of things that we're making. New industries that can be sited locally, close to where these residues live, and therefore rural communities and population groups that have not been served economically, farmers, rural members of communities, and Native Americans that live on a lot of land that can actually take that land and responsibly use it to make products for themselves. The challenges, of course, are the three big ones. What's a good technology? How does it scale? And who's going to commercialize it in a cost-effective way? And if you want, we can talk about that a little bit. But with that, I'll stop.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear about the work that's being done. So as Mary mentioned, I'm Diane Meyerfeld, and I'm with University of Wisconsin-Madison Extension, and my role is as the Sustainable Agriculture Coordinator. And so I look at all things to do with sustainable agriculture, which is way too much. But what relates to this conversation is in the last few years, and certainly I don't see any end to that, a really central focus has been what is the role of agriculture in both adapting to and mitigating the impacts of climate change. And a lot of that has to do with the carbon cycle and the carbon, and that is sort of the inherent focus of the circular bioeconomy. One of the really key issues there is how is in our dairy sector, is the many emissions there the fastest growing source of agricultural emissions in Wisconsin is from manure. So what is the role of biodigestion in addressing those emissions? That's a critical question. In my work though, I have to also step back and really look at the broader issues of sustainability. So when, for instance, when I look at the role of my manure digestion, I want to also look at broader environmental questions, not just greenhouse gas emissions, broader economic questions, and broader questions of social sustainability. and also compare it to the opportunity cost. So clearly dairy is absolutely central to Wisconsin. There are two contrasting models of dairy, and one of them is the predominant one that's been growing, and that puts manure in a form where it emits methane, and that methane can be trapped or collected and then used as a fuel. Methane, as you know, is natural gas. The other model is perhaps a more naturally circular bioeconomy. That's grazing. It's less productive per acre in terms of the amount of milk it produces, but it is much more circular in that the manure goes back immediately to produce the feed that feeds the cows. And because the manure is not in liquid form, it's not emitting that methane. So my role here is to both see what the promise of these crops are. Things like pennycress that can cover the soil during the winter is very exciting, but also step back and say, be the reality check and say, what are we giving up when we do this? What are the other things that are going into this?
Thank you all so much for those great comments. I really do appreciate that. It's really interesting. I happened to be at a bioenergy conference just last week where there's so many activities of things really happening. People who've put sustainable aviation fuel in planes that carried passengers and actually making products. I've been involved in this space for a long time, since 2006, and it's definitely had its ups and its downs in terms of when, it seemed like everybody was wanting to build plants and then there being a trough, and now it's back to there being a lot of activities. And so I'm just curious what you see, what do you think are key emerging trends in the bioeconomy over the last few years, and how could they, if they're positive, how could they be supported or even accelerated? Or if negative, how should we bringing those more into the conversation? I don't know if anybody would like to answer that first.
I'll try. I've seen a large interest in this from a wide variety of groups. Everything from boots on the ground people like farmers and foresters and dairy farmers who are trying to figure out how to put food on the table, how to live responsibly on their land, to industries who see this as an emerging technology sector, to politicians, quite frankly, who on both sides of the aisle, if I can be politic for a second, who are very interested in economic growth and economic prosperity and keeping the United States as an innovation leader. And they see the benefits of this in all of those areas, in particular in the areas where rural communities and that have not been part of this economic sector in the past can now be part of an economic sector that's more just and more representative. And unless you think that what I'm talking about is growing jobs in Wisconsin or the breadbasket and taking jobs away from somewhere else, I'll make the following statement. The needs of this society for fuels and chemicals are not flat, except when we all stayed home 3 years ago, and they are ever growing. And Great Lakes Bioenergy, with a DOE mission and a lot of money, has a mission to only replace 1 out of every 3 barrels of fossil fuel. Not because that's all we want to do. There's just not enough biomass in the United States to replace it all. So there will still be needs for fossil fuel-based technologies if all of us up here are successful. So it's not us versus them. It's creating a different set of processes that spread the technology around the world and around the country and spread the jobs and spread the economic opportunity.
I would like to build on that a little bit. And again, offer a slightly sideways view to that. I agree with you completely with your statement that these technologies we're talking about now in the foreseeable future are not going to replace all of our fossil fuel, particularly if we don't address consumption. And that, from a climate change perspective, is an issue that is of grave importance. And so I think I'm, again, offering that broader sustainability check. While these technologies are exciting, they're a long way from being scaled and being economically competitive. And the most effective thing we can do in the short term is reduce our consumption. And part of what we have to do is think about where can we reduce our consumption in a way that's not harmful. Because as we all know, there's a lot of consumption that is absolutely essential to human health and happiness, but there's quite a bit of it that may not be. So I just want to add that perspective.
We don't disagree.
Yeah. In terms of opportunities and barriers, the one thing I want to say that we wrestle with, or I wrestle with personally and with my colleagues in Extension, is how fast the landscape changes. And even for us who have a little bit of our job is to keep up with these changes. I still have not wrapped my head around the significance of the new legislation within the past year. And then how can we expect the people with the boots on the ground, the farmers, when those of us whose job it is to study that still haven't kept up with it? So I think that's the biggest barrier, and the concern about how long some of these changes may hold through. Many of us remember there was a lot of excitement about carbon markets probably 15 years ago, and then it all went away for a while. And so just the pace of change is, I think, one of the biggest challenges.
Thanks. To kind of continue on this idea of the pace of change, I would see a trend that I'm seeing a lot more in the state of Wisconsin, and also in our fellow states, is the role municipalities are playing. That's really exciting. There's now a larger appeal for companies, municipalities, producers to be net zero, or to look at capturing carbon or to reduce carbon. Although we don't have any hard policies federally in place for carbon counting or capturing, we still see that initiative thriving among all facets. And so municipalities are playing a much greater role in this. We talk about bioeconomy, and I'm going to hand this off to my colleague to my right in a moment, Brian, but when we look at biodigestion, we're seeing a lot more small distributive energy, right? Yes, we're talking about bioeconomy, but if what we're producing electricity is coming from our carbon waste products, that will remain quite local. And this push now for these microgrids and the small distributive energy is really, I think, blending in with this idea of the bioeconomy, not just the products that we're making, but also how we're really interacting with it. One more point into what you were saying about reducing our consumption. Yes, as individuals, I think that's important. And we all realize that not only do we have to turn our lights off, but we also need more efficient bulbs. Moreover, even if you and I did the very best that we could do at reducing our consumptions, the huge amount of material use coming from corporations and coming from things like fast fashion markets really play a big key. And so when we talk about this bioeconomy, how do we integrate plant materials and plant fibers into our textiles, into this idea of really being able to use, reuse, and then be able to throw away our fabrics that actually can decompose in a landfill without being there persistently for 50, 75, 125 years.
A few additional comments kind of go off of what everyone else has been saying, especially around the kind of the pace of the changing dynamics going on. I mean, if I just look at biogas as an example, looking in the early 2000s, it was all about cogeneration and putting in CHPs and making electrons. But then, you know, power purchase agreements went away, sites were shutting down. But then you see from 2017 to now, you know, huge growth in RNG, renewable natural gas, and building more sites now. You know, we're seeing across the US, I think just for digesters, an example, we're seeing about 150 dairy digesters built between 2018 to today, all based on RNG production due to incentive policies developed out in California. We need, and then again, that could go away, and then we'll see sites change. So we need policies and incentives to some combination of those that are going to be long lasting. So a farmer will invest in a technology, or some other corporation will invest in that. I do see some of the emerging markets, so we're seeing a bigger thing in voluntary markets, because, you know, large corporations want carbon neutrality, and they're going to pay for it, and they're willing to invest in other sites to buy their, whether it's biogas or whatever the, you know, means we're looking at. I do think some other areas, hopefully, that will be emerging or growing is really on soil health, soil quality. Again, I think some of our ways, again, we need to change ways we do things. We see many demonstrated systems of, you know, again, getting away from the plow, you know, doing no-till farming, doing injection where we need nutrients. Again, as we see fertilizer prices going higher and higher, we have the ability with this biocircular economy to take these waste products, extract the energy out of them, make them into usable products, but then still have nutrients left over that we can then return to the earth. And again, capturing that and having a negative CI score. So I do think, you know, we can do that in a more efficient way using these technologies. Again, they do cost something, so we got to figure that part out of how to, again, afford to implement that everywhere. But again, I think the technology exists, and the ability to do it exists. It's how do we make it happen?
Thanks very much for all of that. So you brought up so many interesting points. You know, in terms of, you know, as Brian mentioned, that the LCFS has driven a lot of activity in RNG. I think that the prices have come down because there's now so much more RNG coming online. I've heard that now other states might be having an LCFS that will help support that as well. You know, I'm curious, as we think about this supply chain issue, and as I talked about in my opening comments, the decommodification of feedstocks, and the need for there to be these more direct relationships between the end consumers and the actual feedstock providers because of the value of their practices, if that's reducing carbon and improving the carbon intensity score for that end product is a key thing. And so when I think about what Diane said earlier about how do we also evaluate these impacts overall, right? You know, that it's not just about, hey, I've got a really cool technology. Will you just sell me some feedstock that I can convert into it? But how should we have these conversations? I mean, what, you know, we've been trying, that's, I think, part of the goal of this. I'm just really curious, how should we have these conversations? And should some of the things, like the way anaerobic digesters previously were owned by farmers, well, that wasn't their core expertise to try to manage an anaerobic digester. You know, their expertise is in managing the cows and the milk and the, you know, how they're feeding their cows. Is there a different model for the supply chain as well? So how should we go about trying to assess overall and make sure that we're thinking about every party in the supply chain and choosing what are great, making good choices for Wisconsin overall and our landscapes overall?
I don't have the answer to that. I think we have to keep asking that question and keep that central to our goals as we develop these things. And as I hear you talking, obviously the big investors are huge corporations like Bayer. They have the capital, the wherewithal to fund these initiatives. But that also brings a major concern, because that is a huge amount of economic power. So all I can say is it's a really important question, and we need to continue to ask it and ask our policymakers to make sure that the interests of all people and farmers, that's kind of my constituency, are definitely kept in the forefront.
Amazing. And to go on, pass it over. So how should we talk about the supply chain there? I think is where you're going, or how do we best go through it? I think the clear repetition of what we're saying, or the clear repeat, is the need for policy. When initiatives happen, we then get investment. That's how we switch from one thing to another. Sometimes we see them in the form of grants, sometimes we see them in the form of incentives, sometimes we see them in the form of rules, right? An EPA with no teeth doesn't really have a lot of backing. The EPA is actually quite new. It was only founded in the 70s. And so what is their role in all of this? How do we actually look at carbon? I think one way we can talk about it in our supply chain, sometimes we're a little too blue or a little too red, and we allow ourselves to get really divided. But when we can start truly monetizing the cost of these things, that's when the bioeconomy is a no-brainer. Right now, fossil fuel is hard to truly monetize the actual cost of it because effects to human health are hardly ever in that equation. Effects of road and transportation, from coal mining to get it onto a truck, to get that truck to a train, to get that train to where it's going, to a barge, to get it on the barge, off the barge, back onto a truck, finally to a university. To be no longer has our coal plant, but we did up until 2-3 years ago. That has a lot of cost, and a lot of it was on the taxpayers' backs. So learning how to adequately monetize these things so that we can really start to compare it, I think, will be vital in our conversations.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Pamela was saying. And again, I think if you talk to most Wisconsinites and you took politics out of it, I mean, I think most people would be like, we want good soils for the future, so we have good farming. We want to have, clean air. We want our water to be protected. We want to have good jobs, high tech. I think we would like to have homegrown energy. But again, how do you, I see a clear way through this model that we can do that here locally, but how do you get it there? I don't know the answer to that. I think policy is a lot of it.
So let me try one brief comment that I lived through. So you have 4 people up here who work for the university. There was a time when myself and the other directors of the bioenergy research centers were on the Hill talking to congressional committees. And at some point, the staffer heard what we were talking about for science. And they said, you folks can provide scientific data to help us inform policy, whether it's policy to allow a farmer to go off production agriculture with a lot of fertilizer and pesticides to grow food crops, to think about energy crops. You mean you want us to make policy based on science? Wouldn't that be a nice thing, right? There's some policy people in the room that are smiling at me, but I think that's our role. And at least there are policy people that we all collaborate with on campus, but we're the science Jetson geeks up here, right? So our job is to generate the science, and hopefully it'll inform how we make policy.
If I may, I want to add just one other thought. So the center where I work, which works on food systems primarily, came up with a really interesting model about different tiers of the food system that I think addresses this value chain question you asked. And they talk about a tier 0 where you grow the food yourself, to a tier 4, which is sort of the global commodified food chain. But the key distinguishing ingredient that they point out, and I think this would carry over to the bioeconomy value chains as well, is transparency and amount of information. When you grow the food yourself, You know not everything because you're never completely independent, right? But you know almost everything. And so the more we can have information transparency as we move through that value chain, I think the better chance we have to have something that is sustainable.
And it's very interesting. I mean, as we think about, I know that part of the bioeconomy discussion is land use, right? And so what kind of land are you using for what purpose, right? And that making those decisions. And so that seems to, fall into what you're saying as well. And that transparency of information is really important. Uh, and so I think about in other areas, not exactly in the bioeconomy, but a lot of discussion about the use of water, right? And so should we be moving towards making a lot of hydrogen from water, right? In addition to now being concerned about water in places like the West, which are can be short on water. So where we do need to think holistically, about this. And so I think there are many layers in the bioeconomy that need this kind of analysis to make sure that we're making the best use of the assets that we have, and our landscapes and the types of materials and the types of products as well. And that there is this need for this conversation, like what I heard Pamela saying earlier, is that it was important to talk to the farmers in Wisconsin about when they needed to plant soybeans, because that impacted their willingness to use pennycress, and to evaluate it. Um, uh, are there particular areas that, as you think about this, where transparency of information would be really important to the conversation as well? Like particular areas where there needs to be more research to help inform continued discussions?
Well, there's tons of areas where there needs to be more information and more research. And at this nexus of the bioeconomy and addressing climate change, one of them is the details of what the greenhouse gas emission impacts are throughout the whole life cycle of everything we're doing. That turns out to be hugely difficult. You've talked about soil health. That's just a really critical thing that farmers are increasingly managing for. And it's also critical in addressing climate change impacts. But we have general ideas about what things are good for soil health. But when we come down to the details of how is the exact best way to manage on a given soil, in a given climate, we are still lacking a lot of detailed information. Similarly, with biodigestion of manure, there are a lot of questions about how to do that best, how much we are actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions overall through that life cycle, and also being realistic about we are right now maybe capturing 50% of the manure emissions. That's a small piece of the overall emissions of our dairy sector. So we need to think broadly.
I think we need to be transparent about everything we're analyzing and get it out there to people. I think I think a farmer would like to know or should know what the greenhouse gas emissions are from their cropping systems, and use that to make a value judgment on whether 25% of the land is really producing enough crop to make a profit given the amount of money he or she is spending on fertilizer to put on that land, and what the greenhouse gas emissions are from that. Remember, greenhouse gases is not just about carbon, but there are little critters called microbes in the soil that take the ammonia and make nitrous oxide, and that lives in the atmosphere much longer than methane. Well, not longer than methane, but longer than methane and CO2. So that is a negative impact of over fertilizing in an industrial production landscape. We've We've developed, as some people in the room know, an atlas across the Midwest, and we're soon to go nationwide for what are high, medium, and low productive lands, giving existing agricultural practices. And there's a part of us that want to make that publicly available, but there's also a part of us that's worried that when Farmer Jones and Farmer Smith sees that, one of them might say, well, I'm going to take that 25% of my land and take it off of the crops and put it into something else. But that something else may not give me profit for 5 years because we got to get all the pollutants out of the soil that we put in there to let that other crop grow. Well, he may want to do that because of the way him and his family think about it. But Farmer Jones may see that data and say, I don't want anyone to know that those acres are not productive, or what some people call marginal land, because then the tax revenues will come to me and say, that's really not farmland anymore. You need to sell that to somebody to put a development in it, right? And this is land that grandma and grandpa and the families have owned. So this is all a very complicated conversation about making it publicly available, but making sure that everyone understands what the utility is of making it publicly available and having it be used for the good of this carbon neutral world that we want to go to moving forward, and not have it turn around and be used in a way that's going to turn society against what we're trying to create.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. So transparency of information, that's where we're at. I think one area as academicians, as individuals who work in UW system with the state of Wisconsin, we are obligated to do transparency. That's part of our makeup. That's how we're structured. But I think what we need is more transparency with our industry. We don't, you were talking about it's hard to know things. You only know where your food is coming from if that grocery store decides to put a sign that says it's X amount of miles away. Outside of that, we don't know too much more as individuals. We can look at our fossil fuel industry, what we're trying to compare. I mean, the bioeconomy in a lot of ways, it's not that we're not in competition with them to a degree. You're absolutely right. We're never going to fully replace our fossil fuel industry with our bioeconomy industry. We need other supplemental things. But let's talk about natural gas and fracking. What goes into that fracking fluid? Because actually that's proprietary. We only know from a list of 500 to 1,000 chemicals that are known toxic chemicals that the company must identify that's in that fracking fluid, but we don't know what's in the special mac sauce. We just know the most dangerous things that the EPA has said that they have to tell us. So when we talk about transparency, we need to look across the board, and it's easy to demonize our corporations and to demonize our fossil fuel companies. In doing it, there is a trend for more transparency. We could really use some policy behind it, but this idea of publicly showing what the life cycle assessment is of all of our products. I mean, imagine that we could all look at, instead of a food label, a production label, and see what this product has contributed to and approximately how much. When I think of transparency, that's really where my mind goes.
The only thing I'll add to that is I definitely agree. Yeah, there needs to be more transparency, and I definitely think it comes from the private industry a little bit more. So when I look at some of the different initiatives I've been on with the American Biogas Council, oftentimes because we work with a number of different industries and again private companies, they don't want to share their failures or their their successes sometimes, because again they're trying to make the best money they can make on their products. But from that agency, as an example, as we work on different policy initiatives on the Hill to try to get better initiatives for biogas, we're trying to get more of these groups to share data, maybe if we can blind it or whatever, but to have real data so you can make more informed decisions and actually have the policy people understand why we're making recommendations, based off data.
So it's now time for audience questions. And so I'll turn to there's several that are online, and then we can see if there's some here for folks who are here in person. Um, uh, Here's the first question. How can biofuels be produced in such a way that the greenhouse gas emissions timeline meaningfully matches the carbon capture timeline? In the extreme case, if the feedstock of trees takes years to grow, but the biofuel gets burned up in minutes, we seem to be playing a losing game.
So yes, it does take some trees a very long time to grow. We know this to be true, but there are many tree species, I think of poplar or willow, that can grow quite quickly. Even more so when we're talking about feedstock for our bioeconomy, trees are just one small aspect. Annuals, corns, grasses, well, grass are perennials, but corns and all of our cropping systems, that is biomass that is readily available and usable for us. Even more so, let's add waste to this conversation. Wood chipping waste, sawdust waste, those are just wastes that could be used on your home for lignocellulosic, but Gerber baby waste that could be used in biodigesters.
And I think I'll say what I agree with you 100%. I'll say it a slightly different way. I don't think anyone at the table is talking about taking the redwoods down in California and turning them into fuels and chemicals. We tend to think about energy crops, and those are crops that we can harvest every year. You heard about an overwinter crop. We have several others that we're looking at, because these refineries are going to want something at the loading dock gate 12 months of the year, not just in September when people harvest. So we're thinking about cropping systems. Yes, poplar and wood in Wisconsin is part of it, but a lot more. Mary asked, what's changed? So I've been in this game for 15 years. And 15 years ago, industry was saying, I want to take one crop at the loading dock. Now they're saying, I want you to develop processes with mixed feedstocks, because then I can run my refinery 12 months a year, whether it's lignocellulose or whether it's mixed feedstocks. Mary and I were talking to somebody yesterday from the wine industry. What are we going to do with vineyard waste, right? So I think we're moving to that place where these refineries are more like industrialized compost heaps that make chemicals and not just fuel and not just gas.
If we can keep it to waste being our feedstock, absolutely. But that is a not insignificant if. And I think the question comes out of the reports that Europe, with its switch to promoting bio-based fuels for heating and wood pellets, has in part fueled an increase in harvesting of natural woodlands in the southern US as well as other parts of the world. So it is critical that we really address those boundaries to this bioeconomy. And again, we have to circle back to, at the same time, we're developing these essential new ways to use waste, that we reduce consumption, because we cannot grow our way out of the problems we've created.
Other questions from online include, what are the carbon footprint with respect to dairy residuals?
I'll say I'm a newbie in this space, but I will say that a lot of the dairy residuals either go into anaerobic digesters or they are dried down and put back on the ground. And that has some large benefits for soil fertility if it's sold as a low cost product to a farmer. But she made an excellent point before. A lot of these dairy residues are very rich in phosphorus. And all of a sudden you see runoff from farmers who put a lot of dairy residues on the ground into their lakes and streams because it creates phosphate pollution. So that's not necessarily a carbon footprint directly, but it's indirect because of it's got a huge environmental footprint.
I don't know the answer to the exact carbon footprint. I'd have to do the calculation. Maybe someone else here knows it off the top of their head. But again, I think it gets to incorporating many different practices. So again, anaerobic digesters, that's an area I work a lot in. Doesn't solve all the problems, doesn't get rid of phosphorus, but it can transform it to a more different form, which then can go through other processes to extract it and get it out of our groundwater system. So again, there are ways to do these and make them into products, and then apply them differently, and also to manage our soils differently. So they're not just sheeting off the top of the soil and they're being absorbed and being released when they need to be. But again, it's changing behavior, which is obviously a difficult thing to do. And it's doing demonstration sites and researching it, obviously, and publishing it, but then getting a farmer to see his neighbor farmer doing it and getting that change of behavior, because a farmer doesn't usually change unless they trust someone else. That's usually another farmer, or their egg person or land person that they trust. So it's getting that data and demonstrations and showing that how you put all these different things in combination together really solves the problem versus just one piece of it.
I just want to say, I think it's an excellent question that we should have an answer to. Right now we're at the development stage. Well, and then, right, we need to keep that in mind.
Another question from online is, how do we prevent innovation capture by big corporations that buy companies' inventions or technology to prevent competition with their status quo business models?
I don't exactly know how we can completely prevent it, but in the model for my research, we were publicly funded, USDA funded, with this CAP grant to commercialize this crop. We couldn't do it in a vacuum. The role of a land grant institution is to create the necessary momentum needed to really discover what will work, what won't work for these industry processes, how they work, and how maybe we could optimize them. And then we let the ball continue with our public sector. There's a dance that we need to play with our corporations. And so I think that sometimes that dance can get hairy in that regard, but oftentimes, it's sad to say, but if you're really going to make it large in this ecosystem, it almost feels like go big or go home. And so we've got maybe a different question to ask. How can we promote small local businesses? But when we talk about the innovation side, it costs millions of dollars to put forth new battery chemistry for example, EVs. No small individual is going to be able to do that. We need to work in a concert, and we need all of our specialists to help us do that. That's part of the reason why we do get funded by state and federal agencies.
Yeah, I'll say I'm often described in my lab as someone who comes into work every day with rose-colored glasses on. I'm a little more optimistic about the fact that we're not going to face the excellent question from the person who wrote it, because I think as long as we develop technology that is cost effective, with the exception of a major industry that we've talked about, most of these companies are working at pretty thin margins. And if you develop something that's really good, even with a little bit or no incentive, they will bring it out. And I'm seeing that because there's a lot of things in this building upstairs that are proprietary materials that companies have given us to use for research purposes, with several months or a year discussion to get MTAs that they want us to improve for them. And then we bring it out and try to license it for them. So I'm going to push back a little and say that I think a lot of companies want to be responsible. A lot of companies are hiring people that are the age of some of the people in the room here and the age of my son, who want to work for companies that are responsible. And I think that will drive the train. But again, I'm the optimist.
So I'm going to ask Allison and Scott a question. There's still several questions online, but we're running out of time. Would we just answer these in writing? Is that what the strategy should be?
Oh, we can save the questions.
Okay, all right, because I don't think we have enough time given we're just in the final few minutes here. Okay, just wanted to check with you. Sorry that I didn't know about that. So there are other questions online, but we do only have just the last few minutes. And I know that there's a Wisconsin basketball game that's starting. There might be some fans who need to get to that as well. So I would like to just offer the chance for each of our panelists to highlight one thing that you really want the audience to remember from this conversation and what you think is the most, something that is really important from the discussion that we've had today.
Wow, one thing. I'm going to cheat and I'm going to say two things. And the two things are overall sustainability. Don't just focus in too narrowly. And then the other one is transparency.
I will say the following. We are facing a global challenge of major proportions. And I don't believe that any one of us at this table has the single solution to this. I think we all need to work together from consumption through technologies that are gonna be able to slowly change us from where we are to where we need to be. So it's not my way is right and your way is wrong and your way is wrong. So we all need to work together.
I would say the bioeconomy is multifaceted. Take that to heart. Everything can be used. The question is it monetarily valuable enough, or is there enough initiative for it, or is there enough motivation or purpose for it? But it is multifaceted, to say the least.
I'll just say, again, I think the technology is not a limiting factor. I think we can do all of this today, and obviously we can improve on that technology as with everything. But again, I think part of it is, how do we get to this? We say it's too costly to do, but is it too costly not to do? Or how do we value these things? Or, again, a farmer might not get, if he puts in a digester and he removes pathogen loading from his effluent, well, he doesn't get paid for that. He's not necessarily required to do that. So I don't know. I just think we have to look at things a little differently and what the true costs are of different things. So it's a more even playing field of why we do these things.
Well, thank you all again for being here today, and many thanks to our panelists for sharing their expertise. So let's give them a hand. Thank you again.
Well, thanks everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you. Good to meet you. Good to work with you. Do it again sometime.
Thank you. No problem.